Between the Nile and the desert, the land that remembered, before there were kings, before crowns of gold or temples of stone, there was only land, water, and time. In the far reaches of northeastern Africa, the Nile moves slowly northward, a long ribbon of life cutting through desert and rock. Here the river narrows and bends, interrupted by cataracts, where stone breaks the flow into white water and echoing sound. The air is dry, the light sharp, and the horizon wide. At dawn, the river reflects the pale sky, and the desert holds the cool of night just a little longer. This is Nubia. Long before it carried the name Kush, this land existed as a meeting place between river and desert, between Central Africa and the Mediterranean world, between isolation and exchange. The Nile was not merely a river here, it was a path, a memory, a teacher. Each year it flooded and withdrew, leaving behind fertile soil that invited settlement and patience. Human life followed its rhythm slowly, learning where to build, when to plant, and how to survive in a landscape that offered abundance only to those who listened carefully. Archaeological traces suggest that people lived along this stretch of the Nile tens of thousands of years ago. Hunter-gatherers fished its waters and followed animals along its banks. Over time they began to settle, forming villages of mud and reed-shaping tools from stone bone and later copper. These early communities did not yet know kingdoms, but they understood continuity, the idea that life returned each year and that the land remembered those who respected it. Geography shaped everything that followed. Nubia lay south of Egypt, but it was never simply an extension of it. The land between the first and sixth cataracts created natural boundaries, isolating communities while also protecting them. To the east stretched the Red Sea hills. To the west, vast deserts. Movement was possible, but never easy. Those who traveled here did so deliberately, traders, migrants, or armies following the river's narrow corridor. This geography gave Nubia a quiet strength. It encouraged independence. It allowed cultures to develop at their own pace, absorbing ideas without losing themselves entirely. Gold lay hidden in the eastern deserts. Ebony, ivory, animal skins, incense, and exotic goods passed through Nubia on their way north and south. Even in the earliest periods, this land was already connected to worlds beyond its horizon. To the north, Egypt was rising, unified, centralized, increasingly powerful. The Egyptians looked south with a mixture of desire and unease. Nubia was rich, but it was also distant and unfamiliar. Egyptian texts would later describe it as a place of dark soil, strong people, and dangerous terrain. Yet long before conflict, there was contact. Trade flowed both ways. Ideas crossed quietly. Gods traveled without borders. As centuries passed, Nubian societies grew more complex. Burial practices became more elaborate, suggesting emerging social hierarchies. Pottery styles developed distinct patterns and symbols, marking cultural identity. Small chiefdoms formed, each rooted in a stretch of river or fertile plain. Leadership was personal, often tied to kinship and ritual authority rather than conquest. Religion emerged not as doctrine, but as presence. The land itself was sacred. Hill stones and river bends carried meaning. Ancestors were remembered and honored, believed to watch over the living. These beliefs would later blend with imported gods and formal temples, but their roots lay here in quiet respect for the unseen forces of nature. By the late 3rd millennium BCE, something was changing. Wealth accumulated, trade intensified, certain centers began to dominate others. The balance between community and authority shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly, as leaders gained power not only through lineage but through control of resources and trade routes. The land was preparing itself. Though no single moment marks the birth of Kush, the foundations were already in place. Geography had taught endurance. Trade had brought awareness of the wider world. Memory had woven continuity across generations. When the first true kingdom emerged in Nubia, it would not rise suddenly, but as the natural expression of centuries of lived experience along the Nile. As night settles over the river and the stars appear one by one above the desert, the land seems still. But beneath that stillness lies deep preparation, the quiet gathering of history waiting to take form. Shadows before kingdoms, Nubia and the first civilizations. The Nile wakes before the people do. In the soft light of early morning mist, rises from the water and drifts low across the reeds. Birds move quietly along the banks, and the current slides northward, as it has for countless generations. Long before kings or crowns before borders or written names, this river already knew its course. And along its southern reaches in the land later called Nubia, human life was slowly deepening in complexity. By the 4th millennium BCE, the people of Nubia were no longer wandering lightly across the landscape. They had learned the river's patience. Seasonal floods, once unpredictable, were now expected. Fields were cleared and returned to year after year. Sorghum and barley grew in narrow strips of fertile soil, fed by dark silt left behind when the waters withdrew. Herds of cattle grazed near the riverbanks, their bells marking time as reliably as the sun. Villages became more permanent. Homes of mud brick and wood clustered together, often rebuilt atop earlier dwellings, layer upon layer of memory beneath the floor. Children grew where their grandparents had lived, and the past was no longer distant. It was close, tangible, and honored. These Nubian communities were still small, but they were increasingly confident. Pottery styles became more refined and distinct, decorated with patterns that marked regional identity. Tools improved. Copper objects appeared alongside stone, signaling widening trade networks and technological change. Life here was not hurried, but it was steadily advancing. To the north, Egypt was undergoing a dramatic transformation. Separate regions along the Nile had united into a centralized state ruled by kings who claimed divine authority. Monumental architecture rose from the land. Writing appeared fixing memory in signs carved into stone. Egypt's gaze soon turned southward toward Nubia, not with curiosity alone, but with need. Nubia possessed what Egypt desired. Gold lay in the eastern deserts, carried down through generations of skilled prospectors. Ivory, ebony animal skins, and rare goods from lands farther south passed through Nubian hands. The Nile itself made Nubia unavoidable. Any movement into Africa's interior followed this narrow river corridor, and Nubia stood at its threshold. Trade between Nubia and Egypt intensified quietly. Boats moved along the river, carrying goods wrapped in woven fibers, protected from sun and spray. Egyptian beads, ceramics, and tools found their way into Nubian villages. In return, Nubian resources flowed north, transformed into offerings for temples and treasures for tombs. This exchange was steady, not dramatic, but deeply influential. With trade came ideas. Nubians became familiar with Egyptian customs, gods, and symbols, though they did not adopt them wholesale. Instead, they absorbed selectively. Egyptian pottery shapes were adapted into local styles. Certain burial practices echoed northern influence, yet retained Nubian character. Identity remained intact, even as horizons widened. Egyptian expeditions began to move farther south, sometimes peaceful, sometimes forceful. Inscriptions carved into rock faces recorded Egyptian presence names of officials, claims of authority prayers to distant gods. To Egyptian rulers, Nubia was a land of wealth and danger, a place that promised riches but resisted easy control. For Nubians, these encounters carried quiet lessons. They saw the power of centralized rule, the authority of kings who commanded labor and resources far beyond a single community. They observed how belief power and administration could merge into something enduring. These ideas did not yet take root fully, but they lingered waiting. Within Nubia itself, society was changing. Certain settlements grew larger than others, benefiting from strategic locations near river crossings or fertile floodplains. These centers attracted traders, artisans, and families seeking opportunity. Craft specialization increased. Some individuals devoted themselves to pottery metalwork or long-distance exchange. Wealth began to concentrate slowly and unevenly. Leadership followed. Elders and chiefs still guided communities, but some figures gained broader influence, commanding loyalty beyond a single village. Authority remained personal, based on reputation, kinship, and control of resources rather than formal institutions. Yet the idea of hierarchy was becoming familiar. Religion continued to shape daily life. Spiritual beliefs were intimate and local, rooted in land and ancestry. Hills, stones, and bends in the river were sacred, carrying stories passed down through generations. Ancestors were honored, believed to watch over the living and guide their fortunes. Egyptian gods were known by name, but Nubian spirituality remained grounded in place rather than doctrine. Burial customs offer a quiet window into these changes. Graves became more carefully constructed, sometimes marked by stone circles or low mounds. The dead were buried with tools, weapons, ornaments, and food vessels, suggesting belief in life beyond death. Some graves were richer than others, reflecting emerging social distinctions. Memory itself was becoming structured. Despite growing contact with Egypt, Nubia was not absorbed. Its geography protected it. The cataracts of the Nile slowed movement, and the surrounding deserts discouraged large-scale occupation. Egyptian influence was real but never complete. Nubian culture adapted without dissolving. By the late 3rd millennium BCE, Nubia stood on the edge of transformation. It was no longer merely a collection of villages bound by shared environment. It had become a region aware of its value, its connections, and its potential. External pressure had not erased Nubian identity. It had clarified it. The long centuries of quiet exchange, adaptation, and endurance had prepared the land. Wealth accumulated, authority sharpened, memory deepened. Somewhere along the Middle Nile, power would soon gather more tightly than before. Stone would replace reed. Kingship would emerge from custom. As evening returns and the river darkens once more, fires glow along the banks. Voices rise and fall in storytelling. The Nile continues its patient journey northward, carrying with it the promise of what is about to be born. Kerma Rising. The first kingdom of Kush. The Nile narrows as it moves south of Egypt, flowing between darker soil and ancient rock. Here near the third cataract, the river slows and bends as if pausing to gather itself. On these banks, sometime around the early 2nd millennium BCE, Nubia took a decisive step. What had long been scattered now began to gather. What had been remembered quietly was shaped into power. This was the age of Kerma, the first true kingdom of Kush. Kerma did not appear suddenly. It rose from the gradual accumulation of wealth, population, and authority that had been building for centuries. The settlement itself lay in a fertile region, well positioned to control trade, moving along the Nile and across the surrounding deserts. Fields spread outward from the river, while herds grazed nearby plains. People arrived from surrounding areas drawn by opportunity and protection. Over time, Kerma became more than a town. It became a center. At its heart stood massive mud brick structures, unlike anything previously built in Nubia. The most striking of these was the great ceremonial building later called the Dafufa, a towering solid structure with sloping walls and interior chambers. Its presence dominated the landscape visible from far across the plain. This was not merely architecture, it was a statement. Authority had taken physical form. The rulers of Kerma were kings in all but name. They commanded labor, oversaw trade, and presided over rituals that linked political power with the sacred. Though no written records survive from their own hand, archaeology speaks clearly. The scale of construction required centralized planning. The wealth buried in elite tombs reveals access to vast resources. Kerma was a state. Burial practices during this period changed dramatically. Royal tombs grew enormous, surrounded by rings of smaller graves belonging to retainers and dependents. These burials were carefully arranged, filled with pottery, weapons, jewelry, and luxury goods. In some cases, human sacrifices accompanied the king into death, reflecting a belief that royal authority extended beyond life itself. Power once personal had become institutional. Kerma's wealth rested on control of trade. Gold from the eastern deserts passed through its hands. Cattle, ivory, ebony, and exotic goods from farther south moved northward through Kerma's territory. The kingdom sat at a crossroads, and its rulers understood the value of position. They regulated movement along the river and desert routes, collecting tribute and ensuring security. This growing power inevitably drew the attention of Egypt. During Egypt's Middle Kingdom, pharaohs looked south with increasing concern. Nubia was no longer merely a source of resources, it was a rival. Egyptian texts from this period describe Kush with a mixture of fear and respect. Fortresses were built along Egypt's southern frontier, marking an attempt to contain Kerma's influence. Yet containment was difficult. Kerma was resilient and confident. Its warriors were skilled, its leaders experienced. In periods of Egyptian weakness, Kerma expanded northward, pressing against Egyptian-controlled regions. At times, Kushite forces likely allied with groups hostile to Egypt, exploiting instability for their own advantage. The balance of power along the Nile shifted back and forth, never fully settled. Culturally, Kerma remained distinct. While Egyptian goods appeared in elite contexts, local traditions dominated daily life. Pottery styles were uniquely Nubian, often highly polished and decorated with intricate patterns. Artistic expression emphasized local aesthetics rather than imitation. Religious practices centered on ancestral memory and landscape, even as Egyptian gods were known and occasionally incorporated. Daily life in Kerma unfolded at a measured pace. Farmers worked the floodplains. Artisans shaped clay metal and stone. Markets buzzed softly with exchange and conversation. The presence of the royal center provided stability, drawing people into a shared political world. For the first time, Nubians lived not only as members of villages, but as subjects of a kingdom. Kerma's rulers also understood symbolism. Power was displayed through ceremony architecture and burial-reinforcing hierarchy without constant violence. The Great Defufa likely served religious and administrative functions binding community and kingship together. From its height, one could look out across the land and see order where once there had been dispersion. For several centuries, Kerma thrived. It stood as an African kingdom, independent of Egypt, wealthy, confident, and culturally vibrant. In doing so, it laid the foundation for everything that Kush would later become. It proved that Nubia could sustain centralized power on its own terms. But power attracts challenge. To the north, Egypt would eventually recover its strength. New dynasties would seek not coexistence, but control. The very success of Kerma made it a target, and the balance that had held for generations began to shift. As the sun sets over the great mud brick towers and the Nile reflects fading light, Kerma still stands strong. Yet beyond the horizon, forces are gathering. The next chapter will bring conquest, silence, and survival, and Kush will be tested in ways it has never known. Conquest and silence. Kush under Egyptian rule. The Nile does not change when empires fall. It continues to flow past fields and stone, past ruined walls and newly raised banners, carrying the same water northward as it always has. When Egyptian armies finally moved decisively into Nubia, the river bore witness in silence, as it would to so many turning points before and after. By the beginning of the New Kingdom period in Egypt around the 16th century, BCE, the balance of power along the Nile had shifted. Egypt had emerged from a time of fragmentation and foreign rule with renewed strength, ambition, and military confidence. Pharaohs now commanded large professional armies, equipped with bronze weapons chariots and disciplined formations. The southern frontier, once a place of uneasy coexistence, became a priority. Kerma, for all its wealth and resilience, could not withstand this pressure indefinitely. Egyptian campaigns pushed steadily southward, overcoming Kushite defenses and dismantling the political heart of the Kerma kingdom. The great centers were subdued, their authority broken. Royal lineages that had ruled for generations faded into obscurity, remembered only in tombs and shattered monuments. For Nubia, the conquest marked the end of its first great experiment in independent statehood. The Kingdom of Kerma disappeared as a political power absorbed into an expanding Egyptian empire. Yet conquest did not mean abandonment. On the contrary, Egypt now sought to hold Nubia firmly and permanently. A new administrative system was imposed. Egyptian officials governed the region on behalf of the pharaoh, overseeing taxation, labor, and security. Fortresses rose along the Nile, their stone walls projecting authority into the landscape. Egyptian garrisons occupied key points, ensuring control over trade routes and resources. Gold mines were placed under direct supervision, their output feeding the wealth of distant temples and royal treasuries. Temples followed soldiers. Egyptian gods were introduced formally into Nubia, worshipped in newly constructed sanctuaries of stone. Amun, in particular, became central. His cult spread southward, carried by priests and administrators who saw religion as both devotion and governance. Rituals once centered on local landscapes were now linked to a distant cosmic order presided over by the pharaoh. Yet beneath this surface of control, Nubia endured. Daily life for most people changed less dramatically than political maps might suggest. Farmers continued to work the floodplains. Artisans shaped pottery in familiar styles. Families honored ancestors in ways that had long predated Egyptian rule. Egyptian customs were visible especially near administrative centers, but they did not erase local traditions entirely. Over time, however, Nubian society adapted. Egyptian language and writing became tools of administration and advancement. Nubians who learned these skills found opportunities within the imperial system. Some rose to positions of influence, serving as local officials, soldiers, or priests. Identity became layered rather than replaced. Children grew up bilingual, moving between worlds without fully belonging to either. Egyptian dress and names appeared alongside Nubian customs. Burial practices blended elements from both cultures, producing forms unique to this period of occupation. Silence in this context did not mean absence, it meant patience. For nearly 5 centuries, Nubia remained under Egyptian control. During this long span, the memory of Kerma did not vanish, but it dimmed. Kingship was no longer local. Authority came from the north. Yet the idea of centralized rule did not disappear. It simply slept. Ironically, Egyptian domination planted the seeds of Kush's rebirth. Temples, roads, and administrative networks created a framework that Nubians would later inherit. The cult of Amun, introduced as an imperial instrument, took deep root in Nubian soil. His sanctuary at Napata, near the sacred Jebel Barkal, would one day become the spiritual heart of a renewed kingdom. As centuries passed, Egypt itself began to weaken. Internal struggles, economic strain, and foreign pressures eroded central authority. The grip on distant Nubia loosened. Garrisons were reduced. Officials withdrew. Egyptian control, once firm, became uneven. In the quiet spaces left behind, Nubian elites stepped forward. They had learned the language of empire. They understood ritual administration and kingship as Egypt practiced it. Yet they remained deeply Nubian, tied to land memory and ancestral identity. The silence of subjugation was nearing its end. As night falls over abandoned fortresses and half-forgotten temples, the wind moves through broken stone. The Nile reflects stars that shine equally on conqueror and conquered. Beneath the surface of apparent calm, old memories stir. Kush has not vanished. It has been waiting. Rebirth at Napata Kush returns to power. The Nile flows past the great bend beneath Jebel Barkal, the sacred mountain rising sharply from the plain like a dark finger pointing toward the sky. At dawn, its sandstone face glows softly, catching the first light before the river below. For generations under Egyptian rule, this place had been a provincial outpost, its temples maintained in the name of distant pharaohs. Yet the mountain remembered older things, and now, as Egyptian authority weakened and withdrew, memory began to take shape once more. By the late 2nd millennium, BCE, Egypt was no longer the confident empire it had been. Internal division fractured its political unity. Rival dynasties contested the throne. Economic strain and external pressures drained resources. Garrisons in Nubia were reduced or abandoned, and the long administrative chain stretching southward loosened. What had once been imposed power faded into absence. Into this space stepped the Nubians. Local elites, long accustomed to Egyptian administration, did not reject what they had learned. Instead, they adapted it. They understood kingship, temple ritual, monumental symbolism, and the authority of the written word. Yet their loyalty was not to Egypt. It was to the land beneath their feet and the ancestors whose memory had never fully dimmed. Napata emerged as the center of this renewal. Situated near Jebel Barkal, the site held deep spiritual meaning. The mountain itself was associated with divine presence, seen as a dwelling place of Amun. Under Egyptian rule, a temple to Amun had been built here, but Nubians now claimed it as their own. Amun was no longer a foreign god imposed from afar. He became the divine patron of a reborn Kush. Kingship returned carefully and deliberately. The earliest Napatan rulers did not announce a radical break with the past. Instead, they framed themselves as legitimate heirs to Egyptian tradition, while quietly restoring Nubian sovereignty. They adopted royal titles, participated in temple rituals, and presented themselves as chosen by Amun. Authority was sanctified, not seized. This blending was not imitation, but transformation. Nubian kings reshaped Egyptian models to suit their own identity. Royal burials, once suppressed or altered under occupation, regained local character. Tombs reflected both learned grandeur and ancestral custom. The memory of Kerma, though distant, found expression in renewed confidence and autonomy. Economically, Kush revived quickly. Control of trade routes returned to local hands. Gold once again enriched Nubian rulers rather than foreign treasuries. Goods flowed north and south through Napatan territory, restoring Kush's role as intermediary between worlds. Agricultural production stabilized, supporting population growth and political consolidation. Social structure followed. A new elite formed around the king, composed of priests, administrators, warriors, and family members bound by loyalty and ritual obligation. Power was centralized but not yet expansive. This was a kingdom focused first on restoration of dignity, of order of memory. Religion lay at the heart of this rebirth. The cult of Amun unified political and spiritual authority. Kings ruled not merely by force, but by divine sanction. Jebel Barkal became a sacred axis linking heaven-land and ruler. Processions, offerings, and festivals reinforced this bond, drawing people from across the region into a shared ceremonial world. Daily life reflected cautious optimism. Farmers worked fields once neglected. Artisans resumed production for royal and temple use. Communities rebuilt around centers of worship and administration. There was no rush, no reckless expansion. Kush moved forward with measured confidence, aware of both its strength and the lessons of subjugation. Importantly, this new Kush was not isolated. The world beyond Nubia still existed, and Egypt, though weakened, remained culturally influential. Napatan rulers maintained diplomatic awareness, watching northern affairs closely. They understood that Egypt's decline created opportunity not only for independence, but for ambition. Over time, Kushite kings began to look northward with increasing interest. They saw Egypt divided, vulnerable, and struggling to maintain order. Where Egyptian rulers failed to uphold Ma'at, the sacred balance of order and justice, Kushite ideology framed intervention as duty rather than conquest. The gods they believed had withdrawn favor from Egypt and bestowed it upon Kush. This idea would change everything. Yet, for now, the kingdom focused inward. Institutions strengthened, authority deepened, memory solidified into narrative. Kush was no longer a province or a shadow of former greatness. It was a living state grounded in land ritual and continuity. As evening settles over Napata, the temple walls glow faintly in torchlight. Priests chant softly. The mountain stands unmoving, witness to cycles of power older than any crown. The Nile passes below, indifferent yet sustaining, carrying whispers of what lies ahead. The rebirth is complete. The question now is how far it will reach. Black Pharaohs of the Nile. Kush conquers Egypt. The Nile runs northward, as it always has, carrying silt, memory, and meaning. But in the 8th century, BCE, something remarkable moved with its current, not just boats or trade goods, but ambition. From Napata, beneath the watchful presence of Jebel Barkal Kushite, kings began to look beyond their borders. Egypt, once the conqueror, now lay divided and uncertain. The balance of the river world was shifting. Egypt at this time was no longer a unified kingdom. Its authority had fractured into competing dynasties, regional rulers, and powerful priests. In the north, kings ruled from the delta with limited reach. In the south, Thebes was dominated by the priesthood of Amun, who wielded religious authority but lacked military unity. Egypt's ancient ideal of harmony and order, Ma'at, felt strained, almost hollow. To the rulers of Kush, this disorder was not merely political weakness, it was a spiritual failure. Kushite kings had grown within the traditions of Egyptian religion and kingship. They knew its language, its rituals, its symbols of legitimacy. From their perspective, Egypt had fallen away from the sacred balance that once sustained it. The god Amun, whose presence was felt so strongly at Napata, seemed to favor Kush now. This belief did not frame conquest as aggression, but as restoration. The first to act decisively was King Piye, also known as Pianki. From Napata, he launched a campaign northward that would alter the course of Nile history. His advance was not swift or reckless. It followed the river deliberately, securing loyalty as much as territory. Local rulers, divided and wary, often submitted rather than resist. Piye recorded his campaign in a long inscription carved on stone, calm, assured, and deeply religious in tone. He did not describe himself as a conqueror driven by hunger for land. Instead, he presented himself as a devout servant of Amun, correcting disorder and restoring proper worship. Cities that resisted were chastised not for rebellion, but for impiety. When Piye reached Thebes, the spiritual heart of Egypt, he did not sack it. He prayed. He offered sacrifices. He confirmed the privileges of the priesthood and reinforced the centrality of Amun. Authority flowed from ritual as much as from force. One by one, Egyptian rulers acknowledged his supremacy. With Piye's victory, Kushite power now extended from Nubia deep into Egypt. A new dynasty was born, what historians would later call Egypt's 25th dynasty. For the first time, the Nile was ruled from south to north by kings of Kush. Piye's successors expanded and consolidated this achievement. Kings such as Shabaka Shabitku and Taharka ruled as pharaohs in full Egyptian tradition. They wore the double crown adopted royal titulary and presented themselves as legitimate heirs to the ancient line of kings. Temples were restored, rituals revived. Art and architecture consciously echoed earlier classical Egyptian styles. This was not mere imitation, it was reverence. The Kushite pharaohs saw themselves as guardians of Egypt's ancient purity, rescuing it from corruption and fragmentation. Their rule emphasized tradition, piety, and continuity. In reliefs and inscriptions, they appear solemn and dignified, standing before the gods as protectors of cosmic order. Taharka, in particular, came to embody the height of Kushite power. His reign saw ambitious building projects across Egypt and Nubia. Temples were expanded, monuments restored, and sacred landscapes renewed. He presented himself as both a universal ruler and a humble servant of the gods, deeply conscious of legacy. Yet, even at its height, Kushite rule faced dangers. To the northeast, a new imperial force was rising: Assyria. Unlike Egypt or Kush, Assyria was relentlessly expansionist, its armies hardened by constant warfare. As Assyrian kings pushed westward and southward, the Kushite pharaohs found themselves drawn into a conflict far larger than the Nile world. Diplomacy failed. Assyrian forces marched into the Levant, clashing with Egyptian interests and allies. Eventually, the conflict reached Egypt itself. Despite courage and conviction, Kushite armies struggled against Assyria's military efficiency and scale. The dream of a restored unified Nile Empire began to strain under external pressure. Still, for a generation, the Kushite pharaohs ruled Egypt with dignity and restraint. They bridged cultures linking Africa's interior with the Mediterranean world under a single crown. Their reign demonstrated that power along the Nile was not the exclusive inheritance of the North. It could rise from the South, shaped by patience, memory, and belief. As the sun sets over temples in Thebes and Memphis, the banners of Kush still flutter in the evening wind. Priests chant ancient hymns. The river flows on, unaware that distant armies are already moving. Empire at its height, faith, power, and stone. At the height of Kushite power, the Nile world felt momentarily whole. From the deep south at Napata to the ancient cities of Upper Egypt, authority flowed with the river, steady and deliberate. This was not an age of frantic expansion or restless conquest. It was a season of consolidation, ritual, and quiet confidence, a time when the Kushite pharaohs believed that order had been restored to the world. Under rulers such as Taharka, the empire reached its fullest expression. He reigned not merely as a king of territory, but as a guardian of balance. In temple inscriptions he appeared before the gods as humble and devoted, offering gifts, restoring sanctuaries, and renewing sacred traditions that had fallen into neglect. His image was carved in stone across Egypt and Nubia, linking distant places into a single sacred geography. Religion lay at the core of this empire. The god Amun was its spiritual anchor, binding Kush and Egypt together through shared worship. At Jebel Barkal, Amun was believed to dwell within the mountain itself, his presence radiating outward into the land. At Karnak in Thebes, his great temple complex remained the beating heart of religious life. The Kushite pharaohs moved between these centers with reverence, reinforcing the idea that divine authority transcended borders. Temple building flourished. Walls were repaired, columns, raised reliefs carved with care that deliberately echoed older Egyptian styles. This was not nostalgia, but intention. By aligning themselves with the classical past, the Kushite rulers presented their reign as a continuation of sacred history, rather than a break from it. Stone became a language of legitimacy. Administration followed ritual. Officials governed provinces along the Nile, collecting taxes, overseeing labor, and maintaining order. Many were Egyptian by birth, others Nubian, but all served under Kushite authority. This blending created a bureaucracy that functioned smoothly, at least for a time. The empire was not ruled through terror, but through cooperation and shared belief in divine order. Economically, the Kushite state benefited from its control of trade routes stretching far beyond the Nile. Goods flowed northward into the Mediterranean world and southward into Africa's interior. Gold from Nubia remained a cornerstone of imperial wealth. Agricultural production supported both population and temple economies, while workshops produced goods for ritual trade and daily life. Art and culture reflected calm assurance. Sculptures of Kushite kings portrayed them with powerful, rounded features conveying strength without aggression. Reliefs emphasized piety and continuity. Music, ritual procession, and seasonal festivals shaped the rhythm of life. The empire expressed itself not through constant motion, but through enduring presence. Daily life for most people remained grounded and familiar. Farmers rose with the sun working fields shaped by the annual flood. Craftsmen labored in workshops near temples and markets. Families gathered in the evening to share food and stories their lives largely untouched by distant politics. Empire existed, but it did not overwhelm the ordinary rhythms of existence. Yet beneath this surface of harmony, tension quietly grew. Beyond Egypt's borders, Assyria continued its relentless expansion. Its armies were unlike any the Nile world had faced, large, disciplined, and brutally efficient. Where Kushite ideology emphasized ritual legitimacy, Assyria relied on military dominance and fear. Diplomacy between the two worlds was strained and uncertain. Taharqa found himself ruling an empire at peace internally, but vulnerable externally. The Kushite heartland lay far to the south, while Egypt's northern reaches faced constant pressure. Distance stretched supply lines and communication. The Nile united the empire, but it also lengthened it, making rapid response difficult. Religious confidence could not fully compensate for a strategic reality. As Assyrian forces moved closer, Kushite armies were drawn into conflicts far from their core support. Victories were hard-won and temporary. Each engagement drained resources and morale, even as public ritual continued to proclaim divine favor. The empire's strength, its devotion to tradition, also became a limitation. Kushite rulers hesitated to adapt militarily in ways that might undermine their sacred image. Innovation moved slowly. Ritual stability was preserved, but flexibility suffered. Still, during these years, the Kushite Empire represented something rare in ancient history, a union forged not by sudden violence, but by shared belief and memory. It stood as proof that African power could shape the ancient Mediterranean world on its own terms, guided by faith as much as force. As twilight settles over temple courts and incense smoke curls into the evening air, the empire appears serene. Priests chant hymns unchanged for centuries. Stone walls glow softly in fading light. The Nile continues its steady course, indifferent to the ambitions built upon its banks. Yet far beyond the horizon, the storm is drawing closer. The empire stands at its most complete, and therefore its most fragile. Storms from the north, Assyria, and retreat. The wind changes before the storm arrives. Along the Nile the rituals continued, the hymns were sung, and the temples stood serene, yet beyond Egypt's northern horizons, forces were already in motion that cared little for sacred order or ancient memory. Assyria was coming, and its arrival would test the Kushite Empire in ways faith alone could not withstand. Assyria was not like the powers the Nile world had known before. It was not bound by the rhythms of river agriculture or the slow accumulation of ritual authority. It was forged in almost constant warfare, its kings ruling through disciplined armies, rapid campaigns, and deliberate intimidation. Where Kush and Egypt emphasized continuity, Assyria embraced domination. Its reach stretched from Mesopotamia across the Levant, and its ambitions did not pause at the borders of tradition. For the Kushite pharaohs, Assyria was both distant and unavoidable. Their empire extended deep into Egypt, but its heart remained far to the south at Napata. The distance that once protected Kush now complicated defense. To confront Assyria meant projecting power across vast territory while maintaining control at home. The Nile united the empire, but it could not shorten it. Taharqa faced the crisis first. As Assyrian forces pushed southward into the Levant, Egypt became a battleground for influence. Kushite rulers supported allies and attempted to hold the northern frontier, believing that divine favor and righteous rule would prevail. Inscriptions continued to proclaim Amun's protection, and rituals intensified, seeking reassurance from the gods. But Assyria did not fight according to sacred rhythms. When Assyrian armies entered Egypt, they did so with speed and precision. Cities fell one by one. Local rulers, long divided and wary of Kushite dominance, often chose submission over resistance. The Kushite pharaohs found themselves confronting not only an external enemy, but internal fragility loyalties that bent under pressure. Battles were fought along the Nile, their outcomes uncertain and costly. Kushite forces resisted fiercely, but Assyria's military organization and relentless advance proved overwhelming. Memphis was taken. Thebes was threatened. Sacred cities that had known centuries of ritual calm now echoed with the sound of marching armies. Taharqa withdrew southward, not in panic, but in recognition of reality. The empire he had nurtured could not be held together by force alone against such opposition. Retreat was not defeat in spirit, but it was a surrender of territory. Egypt, once ruled by Kushite pharaohs, slipped from their grasp. Assyrian rulers installed local governors and client kings in Egypt, content to control rather than inhabit the land fully. Their concern lay in tribute and stability, not reverence. For Egypt, the change was abrupt and unsettling. For Kush, it was transformative. The withdrawal marked the end of Kushite rule over Egypt, but not the end of Kush itself. The center of power shifted decisively southward once more. Napata regained prominence no longer as the heart of a Nile-spanning empire, but as the capital of a resilient Nubian kingdom. In the aftermath, Kushite kings reassessed their world. They had seen the limits of inherited tradition when faced with new forms of power. Yet they did not abandon their identity or beliefs. Instead, they turned inward, focusing on consolidation, recovery, and adaptation. Egypt's loss was mourned, but it was also understood as part of a larger cycle. The Nile had always carried empires north and south, lifting some while leaving others behind. What mattered now was survival, not as conquerors, but as a people with deep roots and enduring memory. Assyria's dominance would not last forever. Like all empires, it too was bound by time. But for Kush, the lesson was clear. Expansion had reached its limit. The future lay not in reclaiming Egypt, but in redefining strength on Nubian terms. Temples at Napata remained active, though their tone shifted. Rituals emphasized protection and continuity rather than universal rule. Kings presented themselves less as world rulers and more as guardians of a sacred homeland. The cult of Amun endured, but its focus narrowed, drawing strength from local devotion rather than imperial ambition. Economically, Kush adapted. Trade routes shifted southward and eastward. Contact with the Red Sea world and Africa's interior gained importance. Gold continued to flow, though now it supported a more compact state. The trauma of retreat did not erase prosperity, but it reshaped it. For the people, life resumed its steady rhythm. Farmers returned to fields. Artisans repaired what had been damaged. Stories of northern wars faded into memory, retold in quieter tones. Children grew up knowing Egypt as a place of legend rather than rule. As night falls once more over the Nile south of the cataracts, the river reflects the stars as calmly as ever. Empires have clashed and retreated along its banks, yet it remains unchanged. Kush too remains altered, humbled, but unbroken. The storm from the north has passed. In its wake, a new chapter begins, one not defined by conquest, but by transformation. The center of gravity will move again farther south to a place where Kush will reinvent itself for centuries to come. A new capital, the shift to Meroë. The Nile bends again as it moves southward, widening and softening its banks, greener its rhythm, less constrained by cataracts. Beyond the reach of the storms that had broken upon Egypt, Kush turned its gaze inward and farther downstream. Here, in a land of broader plains and richer rains, a new center slowly took shape. Its name was Meroë. The decision to shift the heart of the kingdom from Napata to Meroë was not sudden, nor was it a rejection of the past. Napata remained sacred, bound forever to Jebel Barkal and the ancient presence of Amun. But kings must rule not only from sanctuaries of memory, but from places suited to the demands of their time. The world had changed, and Kush would change with it. Meroë lay well to the south beyond the immediate reach of northern powers. It sat near the meeting point of river routes, savanna paths, and trails, leading east toward the Red Sea. Unlike Napata's stark desert surroundings, Meroë was embraced by a landscape more generous in rainfall and vegetation. Wood was plentiful. Iron-rich soils lay close to the surface. Herds grazed widely, and fields stretched farther from the riverbanks. This geography mattered deeply. As Kush withdrew from imperial ambitions in Egypt, its economy reoriented. Trade with the Mediterranean world did not disappear, but new connections grew in importance, links to Central Africa, to the Red Sea coast, and to Arabian markets beyond. Meroë stood at the crossroads of these routes, better positioned than Napata to oversee a diversified and resilient economy. Over generations, royal presence increased there. Palaces were constructed, administrative centers emerged, workshops multiplied. The shift was gradual, almost understated, but unmistakable. Meroë was becoming the living capital, while Napata remained the spiritual heart. One of the most profound changes centered on technology. Meroë became a major center of iron production. Furnaces dotted the landscape, their remains still visible centuries later. Iron tools and weapons transformed daily life, improving agriculture and strengthening defense. Control over iron production gave Kush a new kind of power, practical, adaptable, and grounded in local resources rather than distant conquest. This technological shift reshaped society. Skilled metalworkers gained status. Trade expanded around iron goods. The economy became less dependent on gold alone and more balanced across multiple resources. Kush was no longer defined solely by what it could extract from desert or river, but by what it could produce and sustain. Political structures adapted as well. Kings continued to rule, but their authority reflected a more inward-looking vision. Power was consolidated around Meroë, supported by networks of regional leaders and administrators. The memory of empire lingered, but it no longer dictated policy. Stability, continuity, and self-sufficiency became guiding principles. Religion evolved alongside governance. Amun remained important, especially at Napata, but new religious expressions flourished at Meroë. Local gods and traditions gained prominence. Worship became more diverse, less centered on a single sacred axis. Temples rose that blended older Nubian beliefs with inherited forms, reflecting a culture comfortable with adaptation. Royal burials also changed. While Napata had hosted earlier kings, Meroë developed its own necropolises. Pyramids were built smaller and steeper than those of Egypt, yet unmistakably royal. These monuments spoke of continuity and difference at once. Kush honored the past but spoke in its own architectural voice. Daily life in Meroë unfolded with quiet vitality. Markets buzzed with exchange. Craftspeople worked in clay, metal, and stone. Farmers benefited from more reliable rainfall, supplementing Nile agriculture with rain-fed fields. Communities grew denser and more interconnected, sustained by both river and land. Women held visible influence in this world. Royal women in particular would come to play powerful roles in governance and ritual, a tradition that would grow stronger in the centuries ahead. Authority in Kush was not confined entirely to men, and Meroë's society reflected this broader balance. Culturally, Kush at Meroë grew increasingly confident in its independence. Artistic styles became more distinct. Symbolism shifted away from strict Egyptian forms. Identity was no longer defined by what Kush had ruled, but by what it had become. The shift to Meroë was, in essence, an act of renewal. It acknowledged loss without surrender. It embraced change without forgetting memory. Kush did not attempt to reclaim Egypt by force. Instead, it chose endurance. As evening settles over the plains around Meroë, smoke rises gently from hearths and furnaces alike. The sound of hammers fades into night. Stars appear reflected faintly in the Nile's broad surface. A new chapter has taken root, quieter than empire, but deeper in its promise. The Meroitic world, queen's crafts and writing morning light, spreads gently across the plains around Meroë. The air carries the scent of earth and smoke of iron and grain. Life here no longer revolves solely around the river's flood, but around a wider landscape, fields fed by rain workshops, warmed by furnaces, and roads leading outward in many directions. Kush has entered a long, distinctive age, one shaped not by conquest, but by confidence in its own way of being. This is the Meroitic world. For centuries, Meroë stands as the political heart of Kush, overseeing a kingdom that is stable, wealthy, and deeply African in character. Though memories of Egypt remain in temples and royal symbolism, in the distant echoes of earlier rule, Kush now speaks more clearly in its own voice. Art, religion, and governance all reflect a culture that has absorbed the past and reshaped it into something uniquely its own. One of the most striking features of this world is the visible power of royal women. In Kush, queens are not merely consorts. Many rule alongside kings, and some rule in their own right. These women are known by the title Kandaki, a word that carries both political and sacred meaning. Greek and Roman writers later noticed them with a mix of surprise and respect, recording queens who command armies, negotiate with foreign powers, and issue decrees. Within Kushite ideology, female authority is neither unusual nor threatening. It is part of balance. Royal women often serve as intermediaries between gods and people, reinforcing legitimacy through ritual and lineage. Their prominence reflects older Nubian traditions in which power is shared more fluidly, rather than strictly inherited through male lines alone. Craftsmanship flourishes throughout the kingdom. Meroë is a place of skilled hands and practiced knowledge. Pottery is produced in vast quantities, both for daily use and for ritual purpose. Its forms are elegant and confident, decorated with motifs drawn from nature, belief, and memory. Metalworkers shape iron into tools, weapons, and ornaments their furnaces, burning steadily on the outskirts of the city. Iron defines this age, unlike earlier periods where bronze and imported metals dominated Meroitic Kush, relies heavily on local iron production. This technological strength supports agriculture, defense, and trade. Plows turn soil more efficiently. Weapons are readily available. Good made in Meroë travel far beyond its borders, exchanged for products from the Red Sea world and deeper Africa. Trade networks stretch wide. Caravans move eastward toward the coast, carrying ivory, gold, iron goods, and animal products. From the Red Sea come spices, textiles, and ideas from Arabia and the Indian Ocean world. Southward routes connect Kush to regions beyond recorded history, tying it into African systems of exchange, older than any written empire. Religion in the Meroitic period is rich and varied. Amun remains important, especially in connection with royal authority, but he is no longer alone. Local gods and goddesses gain prominence, reflecting landscapes, fertility, and protection. Temples are built not only to inherited deities, but to powers rooted in Nubian soil and sky. Religious art changes as well. Figures are depicted with local features and symbolism. Divine forms blend human and animal traits in ways that reflect African spiritual traditions. The sacred is no longer framed exclusively through Egyptian cosmology. It is felt in the land itself in rain growth and continuity. Burial practices continue to evolve. Royal pyramids rise at Meroë, smaller and steeper than those of Egypt, clustered in dense cemeteries. These monuments do not dominate the landscape with sheer size, but with number and presence. Each pyramid marks a life of authority, ritual, and memory. Beneath them, burial chambers contain goods meant to sustain the dead, beyond life continuing beliefs that stretch back to Kerma and earlier still. One of the most intriguing developments of this era is writing. At some point during the Meroitic period, Kush adopts its own script, now known as the Meroitic language. It appears in inscriptions on temples, stelae, and funerary monuments. Some signs are borrowed from Egyptian models, but many are entirely new. This writing marks a decisive statement of identity. Kush is no longer content to record its history solely in borrowed language. It speaks in its own script, shaped to its own sounds and meanings. Though modern scholars have not fully deciphered Meroitic, its existence alone speaks volumes. It tells us that Kush saw itself as a civilization worthy of self-expression and memory. Daily life in this world unfolds with quiet regularity. Farmers tend fields nourished by both river and rain. Herders move livestock across open land. Artisans work near their homes, producing goods for markets and temples alike. Children grow up surrounded by multiple traditions, hearing stories of ancient kings, southern ancestors, and northern pharaohs woven into a single cultural fabric. Politically, the kingdom remains stable for generations. Power shifts within royal families, but institutions endure. There is no urgency to expand aggressively. Kush has learned the cost of empire. Its strength now lies in endurance, adaptability, and regional influence rather than domination. Yet, even in this long season of balance, nothing stands entirely still. Trade patterns change. Environmental pressures subtly affect agriculture. New powers rise beyond Kush's borders, bringing competition and uncertainty. These challenges do not arrive suddenly, but gradually, like a slow change in wind. As night settles over Meroë, the glow of furnaces dims, voices soften. The stars appear above the plains, untroubled by human ambition. Kush endures not as an empire of conquest, but as a living world shaped by queens and craftsmen, belief and memory, iron and earth. Pressures at the borders roam desert, and decline the Nile continues its long journey northward, but the world around it is changing. By the first centuries BCE and CE, Kush stands not at the center of a rising age, but at the meeting point of shifting forces. The Meroitic kingdom remains proud and alive, yet the quiet balance it once enjoyed begins to feel strained, as if the land itself senses that endurance now requires more than memory. To the north, a new power has replaced the ancient dynasties of Egypt. Rome has arrived. When Roman authority extends into Egypt after the fall of the Ptolemies, the Mediterranean world presses closer to Kush than ever before. Roman governors now control the Nile's northern reaches, overseeing grain shipments, taxation, and military defense. Unlike earlier Egyptian rulers, Rome has little interest in ritual legitimacy along the southern frontier. Its concerns are practical security, trade, and stability. At first, contact between Rome and Kush is cautious. Both sides observe one another across the desert border, neither eager for prolonged conflict. Kush is no longer an empire seeking expansion. Rome is powerful, but distant from its core interests. Yet friction is inevitable where boundaries meet. Skirmishes break out along the frontier, forts change hands, raids and counter-raids disrupt border communities. In one notable episode, Kushite forces advance northward into Roman-controlled territory, demonstrating that Kush remains capable of organized military action. Roman retaliation follows, but it is measured rather than annihilating. Eventually, diplomacy prevails. Treaties are negotiated, borders clarified, and tribute arrangements adjusted. Rome recognizes Kush as a neighboring power rather than a subject. This acknowledgement preserves Kush's independence, but it also fixes its limits. Expansion northward is no longer possible. The world beyond the border is closed. While Rome stabilizes the northern frontier, other pressures grow from different directions. Trade routes that once brought wealth through Meroë begin to shift. Maritime trade across the Red Sea increases, reducing reliance on overland caravan routes controlled by Kush. Goods increasingly bypass the kingdom, flowing directly between the Mediterranean Arabia and the Indian Ocean world. This change is subtle but persistent. Fewer caravans pass through Meroë. Market activity slows. Royal revenues shrink gradually rather than suddenly. The kingdom adapts where it can, but the loss of centrality is difficult to reverse. Environmental factors add to the strain. Evidence suggests that rainfall patterns may have changed over time, affecting agriculture in the savanna regions surrounding Meroë. Fields that once yielded reliably now demand more careful management. Pastures fluctuate. Food security becomes less predictable, especially during poor seasons. These pressures do not cause immediate collapse. Kush has endured hardship before, but they alter the kingdom's internal balance. Competition for resources increases. Regional leaders gain autonomy as central authority weakens. The power of the royal court, once reinforced by wealth and ritual, becomes harder to maintain without material support. Religious life adapts, but also fragments. Temples remain active, yet fewer monumental projects are undertaken. The grand confidence of earlier centuries gives way to quieter devotion. Ritual continues, but its political force diminishes. Kings and queens still rule, but their reach feels shorter, their voices less commanding. Social structures begin to shift. As trade declines, communities turn inward. Local identities strengthen, sometimes at the expense of unity. The shared cultural world that once bound Kush together loosens thread by thread. Not through rebellion, but through gradual divergence. Externally, new groups appear on Kush's horizons. Nomadic peoples move across deserts and grasslands, responding to their own environmental and economic pressures. Some become traders, others competitors. Borders grow porous. Control over distant regions weakens. Despite these challenges, Kush does not fall suddenly or violently. There is no single invasion, no decisive battle that ends the Meroitic world. Instead, decline unfolds slowly, almost imperceptibly. Life continues much as before, even as foundations erode. Kings are still buried beneath pyramids, crafts are still practiced, stories are still told by firelight. But fewer resources flow into the center. Fewer hands labor for monumental goals. The future no longer feels expansive. By the 3rd century, CE Kush is a kingdom under quiet pressure from all sides, constrained by Rome in the north, bypassed by trade networks, challenged by environmental change, and reshaped by internal decentralization. It remains alive, but its momentum has slowed. As night falls over Meroë, the furnaces burn less brightly than before. The stars above are the same, indifferent to human fortune. The Nile flows on patient and unchanged. Kush still stands, but the path ahead is narrowing. The long-fading environmental and political collapse. There is no single night when the lights go out across an ancient kingdom. Instead, the fading comes slowly, like a long dusk that stretches across generations. In the final centuries of Kush's power life at Meroë continues much as it always has, yet something essential is quietly slipping away. The rhythms remain, but they feel thinner, less certain, as if the land itself is exhaling after a very long breath. By the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, the pressures that once lingered at the edges of the Meroitic world begin to converge. Environmental change deepens. Evidence from the land suggests increasing aridity, with rainfall becoming less reliable across the savanna regions that had sustained Kush's mixed agricultural system. Fields once fed by seasonal rains yield less. Pastures fluctuate unpredictably. Communities that had relied on abundance now face difficult choices. The Nile still floods, but Kush's strength no longer lies solely along its banks. The kingdom's broader hinterland, so vital during the Meroitic age, becomes harder to sustain. Food insecurity grows quietly, unevenly, affecting some regions before others. In response, people move. Some drift closer to the river. Others migrate beyond Kush's traditional boundaries in search of better land. Political authority weakens alongside environmental strain. The royal court at Meroë struggles to project power across shrinking resources. Regional leaders become increasingly autonomous, governing local affairs with minimal reference to the center. Loyalty shifts from kings to communities, from sacred institutions to practical survival. This is not rebellion in the dramatic sense. There are no widespread uprisings recorded, no banners raised against the crown. Instead, authority dissolves gently. Orders from the capital are obeyed less consistently. Tribute flows irregularly. The idea of a unified Kushite state grows abstract, distant from daily life. The iron industry, once a pillar of Kush's strength, also declines. Furnace activity decreases, likely due to both environmental pressure and reduced trade demand. Wood essential for fuel becomes scarcer as landscapes change. Without surplus production, Kush loses another advantage that had sustained it through earlier challenges. Religious institutions feel the shift as well. Temples remain sacred spaces, but they no longer command the same economic or political influence. Large-scale building projects cease. Priests continue rituals, but without the grandeur that once reinforced royal authority. The bond between kingship and divine order loosens not through disbelief, but through exhaustion. Burial practices change subtly. Pyramids are still built, but fewer and smaller. Grave goods become simpler. Memory is still honored, but without the lavish certainty of earlier centuries. Death, like life, becomes more modest. Externally, Kush faces new realities. To the south and east, emerging groups and cultures reshape regional networks. To the north, Roman influence fades, replaced by new powers in Egypt. Kush finds itself increasingly peripheral, no longer central to trade or politics. The world moves on, carrying new currents that bypass Meroë entirely. Sometime in the 4th century CE, Meroë itself is largely abandoned. The reasons are complex and intertwined: environmental stress, economic decline, political decentralization, and shifting regional dynamics. There is no single conquering army marching through its streets, no final siege recorded in stone. The city simply loses its purpose. People leave, buildings fall silent, wind moves through empty corridors. Kush, as a unified kingdom, is gone. Yet disappearance is not the same as erasure. The people of Kush do not vanish, they transform. Communities persist along the Nile, adapting to new conditions and new identities. Cultural memory carries forward, reshaped by circumstance rather than preserved intact. As night settles over the ruins of Meroë, the stars look down on broken pyramids and silent furnaces. The land remembers what stood here, even if the world no longer does. Time moves forward, indifferent yet gentle, carrying Kush into another form. After the kingdom Kushes, echoes in Africa. When a kingdom fades, it does not fall into silence all at once. Instead, its presence lingers in habits, in beliefs, in the shape of towns and the rhythm of speech. Long after Meroë's furnaces cooled and its pyramids stood empty, the people of the Middle Nile continued to live, remember, and adapt. Kush as a political power had ended, but Kush as a cultural current flowed onward, reshaping itself through new ages. In the centuries following the decline of Meroë, the Nile Valley south of Egypt did not become empty or forgotten. Communities remained along the riverbanks, farming, herding, and trading, much as their ancestors had done for millennia. What changed was the scale of authority. Without a centralized kingdom, power became local and regional. Leadership rested with chiefs, elders, and small ruling groups whose influence was shaped by land kinship and circumstance. New political entities emerged in the lands once ruled by Kush. Among them were the Nubian kingdoms of Napata, Makuria, and Alodia, which would later rise during the early medieval period. These states did not directly claim to be Kush, yet they inherited its landscape, its people, and many of its cultural habits. The past was not erased. It was layered beneath new identities. Religion became one of the most important vessels of continuity and change. As Christianity spread into Nubia from Egypt and the Mediterranean world, it found a society already accustomed to sacred kingship, temple-centered life, and ritual authority. Churches rose near old temple sites, biblical stories blended with local traditions. The sacred geography of Nubia adapted rather than disappeared. Later, still, Islam would arrive, bringing new beliefs, languages, and connections to wider worlds. Again, Nubian society absorbed what came without entirely surrendering what had been. Older customs continued quietly within new religious frameworks. Identity remained complex, shaped by deep time, rather than a single moment of transformation. Language tells a similar story. The Meroitic script fell out of use, its meaning gradually lost to history, yet spoken languages endured, evolving into forms that would later be recognized as Nubian tongues. Words, rhythms, and expressions carried echoes of ancient life, even when their origins were no longer consciously known. Memory lived in sound as much as in stone. Art and architecture also preserved fragments of the Kushite world. The tradition of building small, steep pyramids ended, but burial practices continued to reflect long-standing beliefs about death and continuity. Decorative motifs, jewelry styles, and symbolic forms carried forward elements of Meroitic aesthetics, transformed by new materials and influences. Beyond Nubia itself, Kush left a broader imprint on African history. It stands as one of the earliest examples of a long-lasting African state that engaged the wider ancient world on its own terms. Kush was not an imitation of Egypt, nor a peripheral culture defined by others. It was a center in its own right, shaping trade belief and politics across regions far larger than its borders. Classical writers who encountered Kush or heard of it preserved distorted but telling memories. Greek and Roman texts spoke of powerful Nubian queens, distant gold-rich lands, and peoples who challenged imperial expectations. Though often filtered through misunderstanding, these accounts carried Kush's name far beyond the Nile Valley, embedding it in global historical memory. In modern times, archaeology has begun to restore Kush's voice more clearly. Excavations at Kerma, Napata, and Meroë have revealed the depth and sophistication of Nubian civilization. Temples, cemeteries, inscriptions, and everyday objects tell stories once overlooked or misunderstood. Slowly, patiently, the silence has been broken. Yet, even today, Kush remains less familiar to many than other ancient civilizations. Its history does not always fit simple narratives of rise and fall. It endured through adaptation rather than dominance, through memory rather than conquest. Its legacy is subtle, woven into the long fabric of African history rather than proclaimed loudly in textbooks. For the people who live along the Nile today, Kush is not only an ancient name, it is part of the land's inheritance. The river still floods, fields are still planted, villages still cluster along familiar bends. Life continues where it always has, shaped by forces older than any kingdom. As evening descends over the Middle Nile, the ruins of pyramids cast long shadows across the sand. Wind moves gently through broken stone, carrying dust and memory alike. The past does not speak loudly here. It does not need to. It is present in continuity itself. Kush's story, like the Nile, does not end. It changes course, slows, widens, and flows onward into new forms. Its echoes live in language, belief, and landscape, reminding us that civilizations do not vanish. They transform. The river still flows, remembering Kush. The Nile moves in the dark, unseen, but never absent. Long after cities fall silent and names fade from memory, the river continues its patient journey northward, carrying with it the weight of countless lives. Along its banks, the story of Kush lingers, not as a single moment of glory, but as a long conversation between land people and time. To remember Kush is not to recall one empire frozen at its height. It is to follow a civilization that learned how to endure. From the earliest Nubian communities to the Kingdom of Kerma, from subjugation under Egypt to rebirth at Napata, from imperial rule over the Nile to the quiet confidence of Meroë, Kush changed because it had to. Each transformation was shaped by geography, belief, and memory rather than by sudden rupture. Kush's story challenges simple ideas of rise and fall. Its strength was not built on relentless expansion alone, nor was its decline marked by a single catastrophe. Instead, Kush adapted repeatedly to shifting worlds. When Egypt dominated, Kush learned. When Egypt weakened, Kush ruled. When empire became unsustainable, Kush turned inward. When trade and climate changed, Kush endured as long as it could then transformed again. Geography was always the silent guide. The Nile provided life, but it also imposed limits. Cataracts protected and isolated. Deserts demanded resilience. Savannas offered opportunity and risk. Kush never escaped its environment, and it never needed to. Its people learned to listen to land and river-shaping society around what could be sustained rather than what could be conquered indefinitely. Religion gave meaning to this long journey, from ancestral landscapes to the cult of Amun, from sacred mountains to local deities. Belief tied authority to responsibility. Kings were not merely rulers, they were guardians of balance. Even when that balance faltered, the idea itself endured softening decline and preserving continuity. Culturally, Kush stands as a reminder that African civilizations were not isolated or passive in the ancient world. Kush engaged Egypt, Assyria, Rome, Arabia, and Inner Africa on its own terms. It traded, fought, negotiated, and adapted. Its queens ruled openly. Its artisans developed distinctive styles. Its scribes created their own script, even if its voice has not yet fully returned to us. Perhaps most importantly, Kush shows how power can exist without constant domination. For centuries, the Meroitic kingdom thrived not by conquering neighbors, but by sustaining networks' production and belief. Its legacy lies as much in patience as in ambition. When Meroë was finally abandoned, there was no final proclamation, no dramatic end. People simply moved on carrying what they could, skills, stories, habits of life. New kingdoms rose, new faiths arrived, new languages formed. Kush became part of something larger, woven into the fabric of northeastern Africa. Even today, its presence is quiet but persistent. Pyramids still rise from the desert, smaller than those of Egypt, yet numerous and unmistakable. Temples lie broken but purposeful, their stones still aligned with ancient meanings. The Nile still curves past the same banks where Kushite farmers once stood, waiting for the flood. To walk through this history is to feel time stretch and soften. Empires that once seemed eternal now appear brief. What remains is not conquest, but continuity, the ability of people to live, adapt, and remember. As the night deepens along the river, the stars reflect faintly on the water's surface. The sound of the current is steady, almost comforting. It is the same sound heard by Nubian villagers, Kerma kings, Napatan priests, Meroitic queens, and countless others whose names are lost, but whose lives shaped the land. The story of Kush does not demand attention. It does not shout. It waits like the river itself, moving forward, whether it is watched or not. And as the Nile continues its endless journey northward, the memory of Kush flows with it, calm, enduring, and quietly alive. Lives along the Middle Nile. How ordinary people experienced Kush history often remembers kingdoms through crowns and ruins. But Kush was not lived only by kings and queens. It was lived by farmers who rose before dawn, by potters whose hands shaped wet clay, by herders who listened for storms across open land, and by children who learned the river's moods before they learned their own names. Along the Middle Nile, daily life unfolded slowly, guided by rhythms older than any dynasty. The river remained the central presence even during the Meroitic period when rain-fed agriculture expanded. Its flood still determined planting and harvest-shaping calendars, labor, and belief. People watched the water carefully reading its rise and fall, as a sign of fortune or warning. Most Kushites lived in small communities rather than cities, villages clustered near arable land, often rebuilding themselves in the same locations, generation after generation. Homes were simple, constructed from mud brick wood and thatch. Interiors were cool and shaded, offering relief from the sun. Life was communal, with tasks shared across families and age groups. Agriculture formed the backbone of survival. Farmers cultivated sorghum, millet barley, and other grains, supplementing crops with fishing and animal husbandry. Cattle held particular importance not only as food, but as wealth and status. Herds were carefully tended, their health tied directly to household stability. Craftspeople played a vital role in village life. Potters produced vessels for cooking, storage, and ritual. Their designs reflected local identity, passed down through habit rather than instruction. Metal workers, especially during the Meroitic era, were respected figures. Iron tools improved productivity and shaped daily labor from farming to construction. Markets were modest but lively. Exchange did not always involve coinage. Goods were traded through barter, trust, and reputation. Salt, grain tools, and ornaments moved from hand to hand, accompanied by conversation and news. These gatherings connected communities, reinforcing shared identity across distances. Religion permeated daily existence without overwhelming it. Offerings were made at household shrines or local sacred places. Ancestors were remembered quietly, their presence felt rather than spoken. Gods were approached with familiarity rather than fear, woven into the landscape rather than separated from it. Children grew into this world naturally. Knowledge passed through observation and imitation. Elders taught by example, not formal instruction. Songs, stories, and seasonal rituals preserved memory, linking each generation to those before it. History lived in practice more than record. When political power declined, daily life often continued with little immediate disruption. Fields still needed tending. Animals still required care. Communities adapted more quickly than institutions. This resilience explains why Kushite culture endured even after the kingdom faded. As night fell along the river, families gathered near fires. Stories were told not of empires, but of ancestors, spirits' journeys, and survival. The stars above were constant, as was the sound of water moving in darkness. Kush, for most who lived it, was not an empire. It was a way of life shaped by land memory and quiet endurance. What Kush teaches us: time memory and the shape of civilization. Some civilizations shout across history. Others speak softly, waiting to be heard. Kush belongs to the second kind. Its story stretches across more than 1,000 years, yet it does not follow a simple arc of conquest and collapse. Instead, it unfolds like the Nile itself, bending, slowing, widening, and sometimes retreating, but never fully disappearing. To understand Kush is to reconsider what endurance really means. Kush teaches us that civilization does not require constant expansion to be significant. At its height, Kush ruled Egypt, yet its longest period of stability came afterward, when it chose adaptation over domination. The Meroitic kingdom thrived without seeking to control the wider world. Its strength lay in balanced production and identity rather than territorial ambition. It also challenges assumptions about cultural dependence. Kush borrowed from Egypt, but it was never simply Egyptian. It absorbed, reshaped, and eventually spoke in its own voice through art, religion, and writing. Civilization. Kush reminds us, is not weakened by exchange. It is strengthened by selective adaptation. Time itself behaves differently in Kush's story. Decline is not sudden. Collapse is not violent. Instead, power dissolves gradually, giving people space to adjust. This slow fading preserved continuity. Communities survived because they were never entirely dependent on the state. Kush also expands our understanding of African history. It demonstrates that complex states, long-distance trade, technological innovation, and philosophical depth existed independently of Mediterranean dominance. Kush was not peripheral to the ancient world, it was one of its centers. Perhaps most quietly powerful is Kush's relationship with memory. Even when writing faded, memory lived on in land use, language, ritual, and story. Kush survived because it was remembered through living practice rather than static monuments. Today its ruins rise silently from desert and grassland. They do not demand attention, they invite patience. And that may be Kush's final lesson. Civilizations do not need to be loud to endure. They only need to remain rooted in land, in people, and in the slow, steady flow of time. As the Nile continues northward, in darkness unseen, but certain, Kush flows with it not as an empire, but as memory.